This is part 2 of things I've changed my mind about, and today we're going to be talking about insulin resistance. I have written and spoken a lot about insulin resistance, and that is because what actually induces insulin resistance is a lot different than what most people think. The common narrative out there on social media is that carbohydrates, because they increase insulin production, induce insulin resistance. With that being said, we have more and more data accumulating that insulin resistance is caused by the accumulation of lipids and lipid metabolites inside of cells. These lipid metabolites impair the insulin receptor from functioning properly, and this cell would be considered insulin resistant. And bar none, the number one risk factor for increasing the amount of fat accumulating inside of a cell is obesity, because we can only safely store so much fat until it begins leaking into areas where it should not be stored, such as the location of the insulin receptor. The second most important factor appears to be physical inactivity, because this reduces the amount of lipids inside of our muscles that we actually metabolize and burn, which increases the amount of time that lipids stay within the muscles and can be converted into the dangerous metabolites that impair insulin signaling. With that being said, we do see that high saturated fat intake is much more strongly associated with insulin resistance than carbohydrates or unsaturated fats. In fact, if you directly compare carbohydrate overfeeding to fat overfeeding, the high carbohydrate overfeeding actually results in changes compatible with increased insulin sensitivity, but the high fat overfeeding appears to induce changes that are associated with reduced insulin sensitivity, namely a reduction in glucose disposal after a glucose challenge. And as you replace carbohydrates with dietary fat, you see trends correlating with increases in insulin resistance. And the last study I'll present to you is actually in type 1 diabetics, who are a fantastic model for insulin sensitivity because they are directly injecting insulin every time they're consuming carbohydrates. Therefore, the more insulin they need to inject to control the same amount of carbohydrates, the more insulin resistant we would consider them. And they compared 12 weeks of a high carbohydrate, lower fat vegan diet to a portion controlled, lower carbohydrate, higher fat diet. And they found that despite increasing carbohydrates by almost 100 grams, the low-fat, higher carbohydrate group actually had a 28% reduced need for insulin, and it was estimated that their insulin sensitivity improved by 127%. Essentially, very importantly, insulin resistance is almost primarily caused by overfatness and underactivity. And the other very important factor that causes insulin resistance is inflammation. However, the idea that we should be blaming carbohydrates for insulin resistance doesn't actually appear to be substantiated by the literature and the actual mechanisms of insulin resistance. Therefore, the role of carbohydrates in insulin resistance is one thing I have definitively changed my mind about.